How's it going, people? Welcome to United View and welcome back to another Tactical View. Now, this week I'm delighted to say I've been joined by Charlie, somebody I've been wanting to get onto the Tactical View for a very long time. So you're here, Charlie, to make your debut. How do you feel?
Yeah, very, very happy to make my debut, mate. Thanks a lot for having me on. It's good to make my debut after a nice victory, a nice clean sheet, a nice Bruno goal as well. So, yeah, delighted, mate. Look forward to it. Looking forward to getting stuck into all the tactical elements.
Lovely stuff. So, as you say, a win for Manchester United, and in the difficult spell that the team are currently in, for me, the most important thing going into this game was really to build back and try and get some sort of stability, get a solid platform to build off. Maybe not the most aggressive, open attacking game, given the issues we know United have faced in terms of defending transitions, probably fitness-wise not being in the best possible shape. But I think the most important thing was trying to be all united, all on the same page. Excuse the pun, obviously, and try and defend together and, just nick a win by the odd goal here or there. And I think, obviously, based on the 1-0 scoreline, you can pretty much say United did that. So, with that in mind, I think the key point really here was how United defended and played out of possession, because a lot's been made, particularly from Ten Hag himself, about the way United are pressing at times this season in terms of a lot of high regains, which haven't necessarily resulted in goals for reasons that I'm sure we'll come on to talk about. But in this game, perhaps it was time for a slightly different approach where, rather than the press where, yes, there's the reward potentially of winning the ball high up and we can maybe turn that into a chance, but there's also a massive risk that if our press does get bypassed, then we end up defending large spaces with players that aren't really equipped to do so. The likes of Christian Eriksen, the likes of, as good as he was, Harry Maguire, Johnny Evans, defending big spaces is not really their best asset. So I think in terms of the press and the out of possession approach, that was something that was a little bit of different from United. And that's sort of the theme I want to talk about in the first part of this show here, in terms of the different ways that we approached our out of possession stuff and how we tried to press. So, Charlie, I know this is something we've discussed a little bit off stream and before we started the show. So what differences did you note then from a fairly high level?
Yeah. So I agree with what you said, firstly, about the approach and just getting the win. I think what was interesting is sort of pressing with the front two. So basically getting Bruno much, much closer to Rasmus Højlund out of possession. We've obviously seen Scott McTominay get a lot closer to Højlund recently, but in this game it was more Bruno Fernandes getting a lot closer to Højlund. And I think the inclusion of Alejandro Garnacho on the left-hand side, albeit with Marcus Rashford being apparently injured, I think that gave us two wide players in Garnacho and Antony that were probably more traditional wingers that could play in a more traditional 4-4-2 out of possession. So I think that was a key change. I think we know Antony's received his criticisms, and rightly so, in recent weeks and months. But I think having Garnacho and Antony on both wings allow Manchester United to be a lot more solid in the press. Two players that understand the way they need to press, and also getting Bruno a little bit closer to Højlund as well. I think we managed to force the Fulham build-up maybe to the right-hand side more often towards Calvin Bassey, using him maybe as a weakness, which really gave us some joy. But what do you think about sort of getting Bassey into more trouble? I think we actually generated one chance from that. I think we forced Bassey towards sort of the touchline, and then he lost the ball. And then I think it might have been Bruno Fernandes who ended up having a shot on goal that was saved. But what do you think about sort of the change in the pressing shape and maybe why we've introduced that for this game?
Yeah, so I think coming across to the board here, the way I saw it was very similar to the way you've seen it, of course. And what we see, I think, was Højlund and Bruno starting really high up, right on the edge of the box when Fulham took their goal kicks. Now, it tended to be Tim Ream who actually took the goal kicks and passed them back to Leno. And then Leno would typically, so what would happen with Højlund would be go sort of curve his run round towards Tim Ream. And the idea there was you'd sort of shape Fulham across to their right-hand side, as you just said there, and try and exploit Calvin Bassey, because his range of passing isn't the best. He's very keen to go and carry the ball, step out of defence, but his range of passing when he does it isn't always the best, and he's quite inconsistent. So sometimes that will end up with the ball going out of play. Other times it just drops right on Johnny Evans' head, so we can just get the ball back and start our own attack quite quickly. And other times, even better, it gets passed to one of our free players in midfield, which is ideal. Now, what was different about the press for me in this particular game? So we've seen at moments and at different times during Ten Hag's career where we've had at Manchester United, where we've had a front two that start the press. But I think because of the way Fulham set up in midfield in this game, rather than having sort of straight up a double pivot, it was often more sort of Pereira, well, from their goal kicks anyway, Pereira tucked in a little bit deeper, and it was more like Palhinha deeper with Pereira and Iwobi a little bit further in front. And so I think the way that we pressed and tried to deal with that was a little bit different at times, in the sense that one of Højlund or Bruno was always tasked with, yes, applying pressure to either Ream, Leno, or Bassi, whoever had the ball at the time. But the other one always had to keep Joao Palhinha in their shadow. So it was very much waiting to press, constantly scanning behind to make sure they're aware of what's behind them, and then getting out to try and press Calvin Bassi or Bernd Leno as the moment was on. What would happen then was that the way that we dealt with midfield, because Palhinha was always kept in the shadow of either Bruno or Højlund, it meant that the midfielders behind them were able to lock on a little bit quicker. So what we tend to see was, once the ball had been played out to Bassi, if there was any threat of that ball getting played to Castagna, Garnacho would sprint straight out to Castagna. But what you'd see behind them is a similar man-for-man approach in terms of Eriksen and McTominay initially. But as soon as that ball got funneled out to the right-hand side, yes, Eriksen stayed tight with Iwobi and followed him wherever he went. But instead of McTominay just sticking with Andreas Pereira, what was notably different was that McTominay was actually just coming across to cover space, which is really, really important when you think about the context of United getting bypassed very easily in the press of late. The missing thing when everybody's man-to-man is somebody there who's able to actually be covering space and able to provide that covering option, so that if someone does get bypassed, they're there and ready to get involved, sprint back and be aggressive in the transition. And then the way that the extra midfield player, in this case Pereira, as you can see on the screen at the moment, was covered was that Anthony was shifting across really early to deal with him. So we're not too worried about an immediate switch of play out to the opposite fullback. We just shift across as the whole team, which was a much nicer approach, I think, to the pressing problem presented by Fulham, sort of their build-up shape. And it meant that we were a little bit more secure and less likely to get run over in transition, which I did quite like, because McTominay was there covering space rather than being man for man. So was that something that you thought brought benefits, or do you think that's something that was just maybe the case for this one game rather than being a change that Ten Hag will stick with?
No, that's a really, really good point about having that extra man. To be honest with you, I think this is probably going on just this one game for now. I think because of the setup of the Fulham midfield, and I think Erik Ten Hag has always been this sort of pragmatist that has talked about sort of adapting to the players he's got, and he always looks at the opposition, what he's going to change game by game. And I think when you are in a moment of crisis, I think you need to go back to basics and just say, okay, this is what the opposition's strengths and weaknesses are. We're going to prepare to make sure we can reduce those strengths and sort of increase the weaknesses in that 90 minutes of the opposition and make sure we try and get the best result possible. So for me, I think this is something that's maybe sort of a shorter term fix. I think even the inclusion of McTominay in the team is probably something that will probably go away when Martinez and Shaw do come back from injury anyway. I think we'll try and get Mason Mount hopefully back in the team at some point. But I was certainly impressed also with the wide players again in this game. I think Alejandro Garnacho, in particular, the comparison between him and Rashford in the press is a massive, massive difference. Garnacho is not incredible out of possession, but he's a lot better than Rashford in terms of, I think, curving his runs, when to press, the intensity of when to press, also tracking his runner, so tracking his fullback when his fullback goes forward. For me, I think Erik Ten Hag is probably looking game by game. He probably didn't expect Marcus Rashford to be out injured as well. Would we have set up with, where would Marcus Rashford have fitted into this pressing shape? It would have been interesting to see whereabouts he would have played, whether it would have been in the front two with Højlund, or whether it would have been on that left-hand side. So yeah, really, really interesting. But for me, I think game by game, probably this is just probably for yesterday's particular game or Saturday's particular game.
Yeah, that's something that does really worry me, actually, because I think it was an intelligent change to make and one that we have needed, where we need somebody in there just to provide a bit of cover. But I do worry that if the opposition built up instead with a double pivot, so two deep midfielders, you'd end up with a situation where McTominay can't then be a spare man. He's got to then go and mark one of them rather than being able to be that covering option. So I think it's one thing that Erik ten Hag just needs to work on in terms of finding that solution to unlock the press in every game, no matter what build-up structure you're facing. Because I think in this sense, Fulham did make it a little bit easy. What I did like was the fact that because we're forcing them to their right side, it forces them to our left side. Now, as you mentioned, Marcus Rashford, didn't actually end up playing this game. But funneling them towards that side first of all should minimise, in theory, the running that Marcus Rashford would have to do, because we know he's not the most aggressive, not the hardest worker out of possession. So by forcing them over that way, what you do is increase the amount of distance Anthony's got to cover, but at the benefit of reducing Marcus Rashford's pressing distance. So I thought that was a nice sort of nuanced change. It was both to target Bassey's weakness in build-up, but probably also to help our own team in terms of the profiles of player we've got. But something I wanted to mention quickly was Eriksen and Alex Iwobi. So I think if you look at two midfield players, there couldn't really be a bigger mismatch in pretty much every aspect of both of their two respective skill sets than those two. So I think in possession, there's no contest. Eriksen is miles better and Alex Iwobi, frankly, useless in possession. But out of possession, Eriksen, at times he was run past like he wasn't there. There was one particular moment I remember where he's thought about making a tactical foul. He's sort of put an arm out and he's barely even touched the guy he's supposed to be tracking. So it
Yeah.
is a stark contrast in playing styles between the two of them there.
Yeah. That particular moment is in my head right now. I can just imagine that exact moment in the game. And I think it was. I think when the team sheet did come out and we did see our midfield, I was slightly interested to see how Ericsson, McTominay, and Bruno were going to set up, because obviously we've seen in recent games it's been McTominay who's been the furthest forward out of the three a lot of the time, and Bruno's been the one a lot deeper. But we know Bruno Fernandes deeper is sort of something that we don't really want to see too often. We've seen him on the right hand side, we've seen him a little bit deeper, but we know Bruno Fernandes' best position, really in or out of possession, is slightly higher up. So yeah, that particular moment did stick in my mind, and I think you make a great point about our whole pressing structure and keeping solidity and making sure McTominay was that extra man, because we know, as you said, Christian Eriksen, when pressing man to man, is not really the ideal player in there. So you do need you need around Christian Eriksen, you need physicality, you need players who can cover space. So I think the point you mentioned earlier about McTominay being that extra man was absolutely vital, because Christian Eriksen, we know his, as you said, we know his quality in possession, but if you want to make sure that Christian Eriksen can give you the most he can do in a game, you don't really want to put too much strenuous activity on him out of possession, because you want him to have that energy. You want him to bring that in possession quality to the team. And as you said, that moment when he tried to do that tactical foul, I think there was a couple of others as well. But this is what we're working with at Manchester United. We don't have technicality and physicality mixed together with too many players. We either have one or the other. So we have to sort of choose game models that suit game to game. But at the moment, in this particular game, we got over the line, luckily.
Yeah, and that's all it is at the moment. That's all it is, and all it has to be is just get over the line as much as we can until we get some players back from injury, and we can then really start to build. So you mentioned there in terms of different approaches, different midfield setups, particularly the in possession stuff of McTominay of late, normally being a little bit higher up. So that tends to be more of the in possession side of things. So we'll come on now to the build up structure, and I know you've been looking quite a lot at this, so take it away.
Yeah. So really interesting again, because as we know, even though on paper most teams play with a back four, the majority of top teams in world football now build up with a back three with the goalkeeper a lot of the time. But we saw in this game, Manchester United, very often the two centre backs were split really wide, and we built up with sort of Anana. As we know, he's sort of an extra man anyway. But Maguire and Evans were stretched really wide across sort of the edge, sort of the edge of the box in build up. And that meant that we sort of tried to stretch that Fulham, the Fulham two that were pressing. So Pereira, and I think it's Muniz. I wasn't aware of that guy before this game. First time I've ever watched him. Didn't really make a great impression, I didn't think, but they were their front two that were sort of pressed. They weren't pressing extremely high, but they were just staying in front of Eriksen's shadow. So they were trying to prevent Christian Eriksen getting too much of the ball in those central areas to stop us progressing sort of centrally. So what that kind of meant a lot of times was that although we had Wan-Bissaka and Dalot really wide as well, So they often were really, really wide. So we were trying to stretch the Fulham press to maybe leave a bit more space in the middle, which we'll talk about in a moment. It meant Christian Eriksen maybe wanted to get on the ball a little bit more. He wasn't getting those passes too centrally. So we often saw, as we see with Amrabat, they have that sort of free roam role in build-up. So we often see our deepest midfielder sort of drop into right centre-back, central centre-back. But in this game, it was left centre-back that Eriksen sort of dropped into more often. And then obviously that allowed Diogo Dalot to sort of push more into midfield. And the same happened with Wan-Bissaka on the other side at times, but it was more often Diogo Dalot sort of pushing into midfield, into central areas a little bit more. But yeah, I just thought that was really interesting because Fulham were pressing in sort of they were also in sort of a 4-4-2 as well. And what was interesting was how we were sort of always trying to make overloads in midfield and trying to stretch them laterally so we could get onto knockdowns and second balls in midfield. But I don't know what you thought. Anything else you wanted to mention in terms of the build-up shape?
Yeah, so I thought, as you mentioned there, in terms of the first line with Evans and Maguire often spread really wide, and Arnold being much more involved and much more keen to sort of relax on the ball, play slowly as and when he needed to. And then we had the fullbacks relatively wide, although on the left, obviously, it was often Eriksen out there and Dalot tucking into midfield. Now, I think in general, with a 4-4-2 out of possession shape, as has been the case for, as pretty much everyone's been aware of for some time, the way that you can exploit 4-4-2 is the two central midfielders. So you put an extra one in there somehow, somewhere, and that's where you can potentially get an advantage. So looking at the area we've highlighted here, I think one of the notable things was that Dalot was going in there alongside Scott McTominay, and then Bruno was sometimes dropping in as well, and that was causing the Fulham midfielders problems because we started to get the overloads there. But in general, I think you do have to give Fulham quite a lot of credit in terms of I thought they were relatively compact in those areas. So the best way to sort of maintain your 4-4-2 but not get too exposed in the middle is to squeeze that space as much as you possibly can. And for me, I thought Fulham did a really good job of keeping the back four relatively high, keeping the front two relatively close to that midfield, and keeping that gap between the midfield and defence relatively short as well. And what that meant was that it was really difficult for any United player to actually receive the ball from one of the back players and then turn to then play forward. So I thought in general that meant that we weren't really able to build up through the lines too often. Now there were moments here or there, but obviously the best players United have got in terms of getting on the ball between the lines are probably Diogo Dalot and Christian Eriksen. In terms of Dalot's very two-footed, so he can turn and sort of play out pressure, and Eriksen's obviously naturally number 10 anyway. Bruno's not always the best in those situations, and McTominay normally just receives the ball with his back to goal anyway when he's under any pressure. So I think it was difficult in the sense that United don't quite have the zip about our play, don't have quite the players at this moment in time to actually play through the lines. So I think that what that led to at times was a little bit more of a direct approach. Now, I know you've mentioned something earlier about Scott McTominay and how that direct approach actually favoured him in terms of picking up balls between the lines. So I think the first thing that I'll sort of tee you off with is that obviously that direct approach, if Maguire, Evans, Eriksen, whoever it is, are playing slightly longer in behind that space, because obviously that Fulham back four are trying to squeeze the pitch, squeeze as high up as possible for as long as possible. If United then start to play a little bit longer, what it does is it means the Fulham defenders have got to start running back, get their head on the ball, and then it's going to drop somewhere in that space. So in terms of accessing that space between midfield and defensive lines, rather than being able to play through and access it, it was very much a case of playing direct and winning the second ball. So I know you've got some stuff about McTominay's role in this. So how big a role did he play, and do you think this is why he was included in the team?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think he played a massive role um, again. I think Scott McTominay, we know sort of his strengths and his limitations. I think in this game, he obviously very unlucky to get the goal ruled out that he scored. And I think he one of his biggest strengths is just getting to loose balls to in and around the box, in and around the edge of the box, just sort of away from our own third. We need to get him as far away from our own third as possible in the attacking third, as close to the opposition's box as we can. And I think if you look at basically the goalkeeper's average length of goal kicks, ours was about 5 units higher or 5 units longer than Fulham's throughout the game. So Onana was playing a lot of longer balls. And also our pass directness was slightly higher than Fulham's throughout the game. So there was a clear ploy, as we've seen in recent games, to play direct. We also saw, I'm sure we'll come on to Harry Maguire and his influence in terms of his longer passes and switches of play. But basically, Scott McTominay, in and around that, as you said, when Fulham have to drop off, they head the ball or they knock the ball down. More or less, I'd say probably 7 or 8 times out of 10, it was Scott McTominay that got first to those balls. And he latched onto quite a few, particularly in the first sort of 30, 40 minutes of the game. And what does that do? Well, it takes pressure off your back line. You might win a free kick. You might get a few 30 seconds, 40 seconds of sustained pressure. I know that's not a lot. It's not as much as we want, but at the moment, we're not sustaining pressure as maybe we'd like, but there's probably a reason for that because of the profiles that we're lacking right now. But basically, we're using Scott McTominay to great effect. We're using Andre Onana's very, very good longer distribution to great effect. Rasmus Højlund is maybe somebody who struggled in this game. He only had 22 touches, only completed 9 passes, and I think he struggled in recent games with a lack of service. But I think Scott McTominay is probably benefiting the most at the moment from this approach in terms of making the most of knockdowns, as you said, playing over a press rather than through a press and trying to sort of generate chances from there. But yeah, I don't know whether you wanted to talk on McTominay anymore or whether you want to talk maybe more about, for example, Harry Maguire's influence or any other defender's influence or the Onana's influence in terms of those longer passes over the top of the press.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the final thing we should probably touch on today is the performance of Harry Maguire. So obviously he took a knock early on, came back and delivered another in a string of really impressive performances of late. So what you've got here on this chart is you've got the ball progression from every player on the pitch in Fulham versus Manchester United, and the height on the graph, so that represents the amount of progression via carries, and the distance to the right of the graph represents the amount of progression via passing. And you can see that in both metrics, Maguire is pretty much the best on the pitch. So the most progressive in terms of passing, and in terms of carries, the only player higher was actually Alejandro Garnacho. So I thought Maguire had an absolutely fantastic game in possession. He had to hit a lot of good switches out to Garnacho on the far side. Now, in the first half, Garnacho didn't really take much advantage or much benefit out of getting the ball in those positions. But in the second half, Garnacho started to really come alive and do a lot better. But look, when a team is playing really compact out of possession like Fulham were, the key is often, as you said there, to go over, to go around, rather than playing through. And at this moment in time, Harry Maguire is fully justifying his selection, and you can see in his numbers pretty much every game why he plays. So, look, another great performance from him.
Yeah, really good. As he's been in the last few games, really. He won 80% of his aerial duels. His long passes were, even if they're not always accurate, the opposition player might head it out for a throw in. You get out the pitch, so it's important. And obviously with his ground duels as well. And to be honest with you, I think he's playing really well. I think he's playing really well. Even whether it's with Evans, whether it's with Varane, whoever it might be, he's playing really well. And that graph that you just showed, he's been towards the top of that graph for quite a few games recently. So you often see like a clutter of players in the middle, and then Maguire's just at the top right, towards the top right in more or less every game. So yeah, really impressive, and it shows character to come back from where he's come from and produce like this. So you've got to applaud him for that.
Absolutely. I think a brilliant performance from Maguire. United as a team did just about what was needed to get over the line. And look, 2 more games to go until the international break, and it has to be 2 wins. And it has to be 2 wins because against Copenhagen, is it in the week?
Yep.
Yeah, against Copenhagen, there's no more room for any slip-ups at all in the Champions League if we want to go through to the knockout stages. And for the game against Luton, quite frankly, we cannot be embarrassed by losing to Luton at Old Trafford. No, that can't happen. The team, the manager, nobody can allow that to happen. So it has to be 2 wins this week, have to be going into the international break on a high. And look, if that happens, a bit more time, get more players back from injury. And in all honesty, I think we're on the same points as we were this time last season, aren't we, at this point? So, given the crisis that's been engulfing United so far, it's not that bad of a start, in all honesty. Now, look, it's not title contending, but it's not awful. And on that note, thank you guys very much for watching. Thank you, Charlie, for your brilliant debut. Let us know what you thought in the comments down below. And we'll see you guys again very soon on the Tactical View.